Hi everyone, it's Ray, the singing Tallit. Continuing to read Understanding the Difficult Words of Jesus by David Bivin and Roy Blizzard Jr. This is a much smaller book than the Alfred Edersheim book we have been reading, but I believe that it will give us a very good understanding of some of the very Hebraic sayings that are in the New Testament that are spoken by Yeshua. Chapter 2, The Assumptions of Liberal Scholarship. There are many different theories and variations of theories as to the origin of the Synoptic Gospels and the language in which they were originally communicated. The problem of the relationship of the synoptists, that is to say those who wrote the Synoptic Gospels, was first seriously discussed by Augustine in about 430 AD. The most commonly accepted theory to date is that Mark was the first of the Synoptic Gospels, and then that Matthew, Luke, and then Mark, in writing their Gospels, originally, and the priority of Mark was first suggested in the late 18th century and remains the prevailing theory among most New Testament critics. In addition, most scholars for the last 150 to 200 years have generally assumed either a Greek or Aramaic origin for most synoptic materials. In fact, I know a couple, what's his name, Christopher, he is an Aramaic primus, and I think the Holy Language Institute is also Aramaic primists, that they feel that one of the oldest texts of the New Testament is an Aramaic text, and they say that's probably one of the originals. And it's very possible, I don't know. These basic assumptions of scholarships have in many ways proved to be a hindrance in establishing a proper approach to biblical studies. For example, the New Testament records the life of Jesus and all his teachings, and were alleged by liberal scholars to be based on late and faulty transmission of oral reports recorded by a Greek-speaking church far removed from the unsophisticated Judean and Galilean scene. These liberal scholarship greatly influenced the evangelical approach to the New Testament. Evangelicals, who were often less formally educated and thus unable to critically appraise the assumption of liberal scholarship, surprisingly fell right into line. One recent 1974 survey of the New Testament by Robert G. Gromacki, an evangelical, contains the following statement, and this is the quote: "Although Alexander is mainly known as a great military strategist, his main contribution was the spreading of the Greek culture and language to the Near East. The Hellenization was so complete that in the next 600 years, that is from 300 BC to 300 AD, saw Greek become the lingua franca of the Mediterranean world." That means the language that people spoke. "A highly sophisticated language with its many declensions, conjugations, and grammatical technicalities. It was the perfect medium in which the New Testament could be written." But of course, the New Testament is written in the Koine Greek, which is the common man's Greek and not the formal Greek. That's the one that has all the colloquial terms in it and stuff. Note, the assumption was that the original language of the whole New Testament was in fact Greek. In another place, Gromacki states, "As someone has pointed out," Gromacki does not specify his source, "the Greek text of Matthew reads more like the original edition than like a translation." Harrison correctly observes, quote, "Despite this tradition of a Semitic original, the fathers have no information of the translation of it into a Greek. What they knew and used for themselves was a Greek gospel. The statement by Papias is intriguing, but until more objective evidence is forthcoming, the position that Matthew wrote the entire book in Greek must stand." And that's from the book that Gromacki wrote. To say that the statement of Papias, a church father of the 2nd century, is intriguing is to question Papias' veracity. The simple, straightforward statement of Papias seems objective, and that is to say that he said, quote, "Matthew put down the words of the Lord in the Hebrew language, and others have translated them as best as they could." And that's from Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History. And Nehemiah Gordon quoted that in one of his presentations where the church father Papias from the 2nd century literally said Matthew was written in Hebrew. Scholarly assumptions as to the linguistic origins of the Synoptic Gospels have become so deeply ingrained in the thinking of most non-Hebrew speaking Christians that to challenge these hypotheses is considered by most as a near heresy. Be that as it may, it can be stated unequivocally that the original life of Jesus was communicated in Hebrew, and that Hebrew was also very likely the spoken language of the Jesus of Nazareth. This being the case, it necessitates an entire re-examination of popular theories about linguistic origins and a reorientation of the study of the New Testament. And that concludes chapter 2. This is a much easier to read book with many fewer footnotes, I can tell you that. I see, my only footnote I see is see also page 46. I mean, that was a 1, 2, 3. That was a 3-page chapter. So we're going to get through this book pretty quick, obviously. But he makes sure to give you the very clear point that Papias, an accepted church father, said clearly that Matthew was written in the Hebrew language first. I'll go ahead and start on chapter 3. This is titled, An Examination of the Aramaic and Greek Theories. In the view of the fact that the majority of the New Testament scholars have in recent times favored an Aramaic or Greek origin of the Synoptic Gospels, it is necessary for us to examine the pros and the cons of each of these two theories. The Aramaic theory. It is interesting that the same individuals who espouse the inerrancy of the Scriptures will take the specific passages in the New Testament that refer to Jesus speaking Hebrew, that is Acts 26:14, or Paul speaking Hebrew, that is Acts 21:40, and say that actually means Aramaic and not Hebrew. The Aramaic theory has so heavily influenced biblical scholarship that even though those who should be the most capable of working with the biblical text, namely that is biblical translators, have translated Aramaic when the original term in fact states that it is Hebrew. For example, the New Testament version published by Zondervan Bible Publishers, remember this book is written in 1983, purposely translates Hebrew as Aramaic, and only in 26:14 does it even bother to give a footnote that says, or Hebrew, in italics at the bottom of the page. The New American Standard Bible translates Hebrew dialect in both passages, but adds the footnote Jewish Aramaic. Since the majority of scholars have favored Aramaic origins of the Synoptic Gospels, there must be strong reasons for their acceptance of this theory. But when one examines the evidence, one learns that there are no strong reasons available to support an Aramaic origin apart from the appearance of certain Aramaic, or what often seem to be Aramaic words or phrases scattered throughout the New Testament, particularly the text of the Gospels. In fact, there is a much stronger evidence against the theory of Aramaic origins. And he gives us a footnote. He says, see pages 54-55 for a short history of the Aramaic language. According to the Codex Sinaiticus, the Codex Alexandrinus, and the Codex Bezae, 3 of the most ancient Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, reading from the 4th and 5th centuries AD, it is stated that the inscription reads, quote, "This is the King of the Jews," Luke 23:38. Over the cross of Jesus was written in Greek and in Latin and in Hebrew. It is not significant that the oldest Greek textual tradition infers that Hebrew was more popular than Aramaic in this time. Those who claim an Aramaic cultural milieu for the period have often noted that our Gospels contain Aramaic words like Talitha, Kumai, Ephata, Rabbani, and a few other interesting words. Although it is true that our Gospels do have some Aramaic words, so do all the Hebrew documents written around the time of Jesus. For instance, the Mishnah and the Dead Sea Scrolls. The book of Jeremiah, dating from a much earlier period and overwhelmingly Hebrew, introduces a sentence, and it includes a sentence in Aramaic, which is Jeremiah 10:11. Even the book of Genesis contains a 2-word Aramaic phrase, that is in Genesis 31-47. In the Hebrew of the 1st century, we find many Aramaic loanwords, that is to say, words borrowed from Aramaic. This is also true of the New Testament in general. However, upon closer scrutiny, many supposed Aramaic words turn out to be Hebrew. For instance, sakara, strong drink in Luke 1:15, is also included in the list of Aramaic words in the New Testament because of the ending a. It is assumed that sakara is a Greek transliteration of the Aramaic word shikra rather than the Hebrew shikar. However, if one will check in the Hatch-Redpath Concordance to the Septuagint, and he cites the work there, he will note that Sekira is the standard Greek translation of the Hebrew word shikar. The A ending is not the Aramaic definite article, but simply the Greek neuter ending. What is true of the A in Sakara is also true of the A in Sabata in Matthew 12:10 and Pesha, or Passover, in Luke 2:41. Even the presence of an Aramaic word such as Abba does not prove the existence of an original Aramaic. Abba appears over and over in Hebrew writings of the period as a loan word, borrowed from Aramaic because of its special flavor, and used in the same way as we would say daddy or papa in English. Today in modern Israel, children use Abba in addressing their fathers exactly the same way it was used in the time of Jesus. Perhaps the most often quoted Aramaism in the New Testament is a sentence in Mark 15:34, that is, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. These words are Aramaic, but it is doubtful that Jesus spoke them as Mark records. The people hearing the words thought Jesus was calling Elijah. For them to make that mistake, Jesus would have had to have cried out, Eli, Eli, not Eloi, Eloi. Why? Because Eli in Hebrew can be either the word my God, or it can be a shortened version of the phrase Eliyahu, which is his name. Because we would say Elijah, but in Hebrew it would be Eliyahu. And in Matthew 27:16, further, lama, or why, is the same word in both languages. And sabach is a verb which is found not only in Aramaic, but also in the Mishnaic Hebrew. On the basis of the few Aramaic words that might be found, should we overlook the many more numerous Hebrew words that appear in the Greek text of the Gospels, such as levana, or frankincense, mammon, which is in Luke 16:9, way, for woe, in Matthew 23:13, rabbi in Matthew 23:7 and 8, Beelzebub, Luke 11:15, Corban, Mark 7 and 11, Satan, which is in Luke 18, Kamun, for cumin, in Matthew, Rakah, a term of contempt which literally means to be empty, More, to be a rebel, Bath, a wet measure between 8 and 9 gallons, Kor, a dry measure between 10 and 12 bushels, Zumnim, which are the tares, Boanerges, which is the sons of thunder, Mor for myrrh, Sheik Ma, which is sycamore, and Amen, which appears about 100 times in the Greek text of the Gospels. Today the evidence for Hebrew is quite overwhelming, and yet many Christians still cling to the outmoded Aramaic hypothesis as if their faith depended upon it. Over the years, whenever any scholar argued in favor of Hebrew, or even when a Hebrew scroll or inscription came to light, advocates of the Aramaic theory were quick to explain away the evidence, for example, saying, when the New Testament or Josephus says Hebrew, proponents of the Aramaic hypothesis say simply that they meant Aramaic. When only Hebrew, Greek, and a few Latin inscriptions were found from the Roman period in the Temple Mount excavations, it was said of the Hebrew inscriptions, quote, they are only representative of the Hebrew used by the priests in a sacred area, but not indicative of the spoken language of the common man. So they basically think that if a common man came and read a sign, for instance, in the temple, there was a sign that said, Gentiles, if you cross this line, If you pass this sign, we will kill you, and the Romans won't do anything about it. If you enter into the holy court of the temple, beyond the Gentile court. It was said of the Mishnah and other rabbinic works, quote, these admittedly are written in Hebrew, but it is an artificial language used only for study and discussion by the rabbis and their students of Talmudic academies. Concerning this last argument, it should be noted that as early as 1927, the great Jewish scholar M.H. Segal demonstrated conclusively that Mishnaic Hebrew was not an artificial language only used by the rabbinic scholars in Talmudic academies, but that it exhibits all the characteristics of a living language. The authors do not wish to imply that Aramaic, as well as Greek, were not spoken in Israel in the 1st century BC and AD. Certainly most of the people were multilingual, or at least bilingual, with Aramaic, Greek, and even some Latin, and some common use alongside certain Hebrew quotes. And to quote Segal, he says, what was the language of the ordinary life of the educated native Jews in Jerusalem and Judea in the period from 400 BC to 150 AD? The evidence presented by Mishnaic Hebrew and its literature leaves us no doubt that the language was Mishnaic Hebrew. Of course, those educated Judeans also understood Aramaic and used it in many of their writings, but only occasionally and not habitually, in the same way as the Flamand in Belgium may often use French. So he's saying that they would occasionally use a word from Aramaic that would best fit the situation. For instance, in English, you might say, well, c'est la vie, you know. And you'd be like, what is c'est la vie? It's a French phrase. It means such is life. You know, that's the way things go. C'est la vie. What am I going to do about it? That's life. That's a French phrase, but we stick it in English sometimes, or, you know, it just happens. Sometimes words will jump across one language to another. Like, for instance, many English words come straight from the Native Americans, at least in the United States. Canoe, TP, words like that. I mean, we took those straight from the Native Americans because they knew what those things were, and they had to teach us what they were. All right, Segal's conclusions were largely ignored by Christian scholars and soon forgotten. Since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, however, the leading proponents of the Aramaic theory have gradually begun to modify their views. Matthew Black, for instance, in his 3rd edition of his most influential book, called An Aramaic Approach to the Gospels and Acts, remarks, quote, the Qumran discoveries have also shed fresh light on the problem. M. Wilcox writes, with regard to the matter of language, we ought to note that the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls has now placed at our disposal information of a highly interesting and relevant nature. The non-biblical texts show us a free and living language and attest the fact that in New Testament times, for a far more considerable time previously, Hebrew was not only confined to rabbinic circles by any means, but appeared as a normal vehicle of expression. I mean, you gotta understand, if you're a part of a culture where, you know, every Shabbat you go to the synagogue and you hear Hebrew read, and you already know Aramaic, and Aramaic and Hebrew have a whole lot of similarity between them, you're going to become pretty good with Hebrew, especially if you actually are bothering to learn how to read and write. Because if you're going to read and write, you're going to use Hebrew character letters anyways to do it. You're going to use these block Hebrew letters. So you're probably going to learn how to write Hebrew. I mean, I'm making an assumption there, but I see where they're going with this. If this is a correct estimate of the Qumran evidence, remember that's the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were found at Qumran, where Hebrew certainly vastly predominates over Aramaic, then it may be held to confirm the view identified with the name of Professor Segal, that Hebrew was actually a spoken vernacular in Judea in the time of Christ. Oh, how unthinkable, right? And that book, by the way, was written in 1967, because this is, probably a decade after the Dead Sea Scrolls have been found, and when people actually started studying them. It's not just, the Dead Sea Scrolls don't only contain, the book of Isaiah and the Torah, but also things that aren't, necessarily Bible-oriented. There's just, laundry lists of things people had to do census data, just things that were important to the Essenes at the time, maybe even some of their own writings. But the point he's making is that the vast majority of the language, that at least the people that they were the Essenes, who, by the way, wanted to be the most holy people. They outdid the Pharisees to the point that they literally separated themselves from even Jerusalem because it was too corrupt, with the Pharisees and the Sadducees being too corrupted as far as the Essenes were concerned. But they were using Hebrew as a living language. In other words, when you have a living language, you have a language where people are speaking it, and it's picking up little weird phrases, little idioms, new ways of contracting words together. Like down south, we say y'all, which is you. And in English, technically, the plural of you is still you, but down south, we're like, that makes no sense. If I say you, you're going to think I'm talking about you. If I'm talking about a group of you, I'm talking about y'all. But up north, they'd say yous. We're talking about yous. And actually in Pittsburgh, they say yens. When I lived up there for a while. So just needless to say, in a living language, people keep figuring out new ways to work with it and change things. And that's what this scholar's saying, is that from the find that they made in Qumran, which is the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was a lot of interesting and on-the-fly changes being made by people who were writing. But they were writing in Hebrew. They weren't treating it like some kind of, like the Latin. Latin became a holy language. It's a dead language. It became the language of lawyers and mathematicians and Catholic priests. And it did not grow and did not change. It remained the same for hundreds of years. They're saying that some people tried to say that's what Hebrew was doing, but these guys are saying, no, the archaeological evidence we have found is that Hebrew was growing and changing during the time of Christ, because people were speaking it and on a regular basis with one another. It cannot be ignored when discussing the linguistic milieu of the first century. Milieu, by the way, is the group in which you are doing something, or the situation in which you are doing something. And that's a word you don't hear a lot. Milieu of the first century of Palestine, that the foremost Aramaic theorist, Matthew Black, is now obliged to admit, quote, "We must nevertheless allow the possibility, more than has been done before, for the use of Hebrew in addition to, or instead of, Aramaic by Jesus himself." And that's from Black's book that was written in 1967. All right, that's his statements about the Aramaic primacy theory. Now we'll go with the Greek primacy theory. Although the overwhelming majority of scholars subscribe to a Semitic origin for the Gospels, there are those nonetheless, such as the English scholar Nigel Turner, who propose a Greek origin. Apart from the linguistic and cultural arguments of the Semitic origin, it remains an important fact that the poor Greek of the Synoptic Gospels is found basically only in literary works that are translation from Semitic originals, such as the Septuagint. Many gospel expressions are not just poor Greek, but actually meaningless in Greek. One brief example will suffice to illustrate this fact. The text of Matthew 6, 22 through 23 literally reads, quote, "The lamp of the body is the eye. If your eye is good, your whole body is full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body is full of darkness." The expressions good eye and bad eye are common Hebrew idioms for being generous or being miserly. In other words, a man who's got the evil eye is very greedy. He won't give up his money. A man who's got good eyes is the kind of man who's willing to do exactly what the Torah says, which is to loan money to people when they need it. And in fact, you're really just giving it to them because if the Shemitah's around the corner, they're just never going to pay you back anyways. You might as well think of it as just giving it to people when you loan them money. And if Father blesses you, that person will actually pay you back. Needless to say, you can't spend your time holding it against them. Don't get me wrong, the Pharisees figured out how to work their way around that and made it so that people had to pay back even after the Shemitah. But that's, if you want to learn about that, that's in Alfred Edersheim's The Temple and Its Ministries. And he'll explain the process of turning the temple into a bank account that you could use to funnel your money through before you loaned it, so that the person you loaned it to would have to pay the temple back no matter what. But like I said, it's in that book. Let's see. Greek has no such idioms, and in Greek, this statement of Jesus is meaningless, just as it is in English. Why is the Greek of the Gospels such poor Greek? Very simply, because Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not really Greek, but Hebrew words in Greek dress, or we might say a translation in Greek. Are we claiming that the Synoptic Gospels were not originally written in Greek? To this we must answer yes and no. The Synoptic Gospels, as we have them today, were originally written in Greek. However, the text which they have descended from was originally translated from a Hebrew archetype. It is easy to see how scholars such as Gromacki and Turner, not understanding this process of gospel textual transmission, could assume a Greek text. However, it is the undertext of our canonical Gospels that reveals the original Hebrew. And he goes farther into this in chapter 6, and we'll get there eventually. Our canonical Gospels are based on Greek texts derived from the Greek translation of the original Hebrew story of the life of Jesus. It is most unfortunate that our Bible colleges and seminaries focus their attention on Greek and Hellenistic theology, and fail, by and large, to equip their students with the proper tools that would allow them to do serious biblical exegesis. A strong statement, to be sure, but sadly all too true. It cannot be overemphasized that the key to an understanding of the New Testament is a fluid knowledge of Hebrew and an intimate acquaintance with Jewish history, culture, and rabbinical literature. The evidence for Aramaic and Greek origins of the Synoptic Gospels simply will not stand up under critical analysis. There is a far more substantial evidence indicating a Hebrew origin of the Synoptic Gospels. I don't have a problem agreeing with this, but my reason would be because the disciples, who certainly went to the synagogue, who certainly heard the law of Moses read to them in Hebrew, and most assuredly knew Aramaic, when they were recording what happened, I am sure that they would have used the holy language, at least to record it in, so that when they shared it with other Jews, because you remember, Christianity is not a thing unto itself, it's a Jewish sect. Every person who calls himself a Christian should call himself a Jew, because it is a sect of Judaism. That's what it is. It's what it's always has been. So when you consider that, it's no surprise that Peter, James, John would write the holy language when they were writing about the Messiah of Israel. Now, of course, they were dealing with Greek people later in their careers, so no surprise they would be like, no problem, translate it into Greek, and we'll have a miraculous holy translation, just the way the Septuagint was a miraculous holy translation. The 72, okay, the Septuagint. Let's take a moment and flash back here. When the Septuagint was translated, it was given to the Ptolemies in Egypt, right? So the Jews sent a congregation of 72 rabbis to translate this document as a gift to the king, to the Ptolemy, the Greek king Ptolemy. They all translated it separately. They all came up with exactly the same translation. It was considered a great miracle. That's why it's called the Septuagint. The 72 translated, and all of them had the same translation. It's a miracle. So, no surprise that the disciples, who had already seen so many Old Testament miracles mirrored in their own lives at that point, right up to seeing the arcs of lightning come down from. See, I'm saying arcs of lightning instead of tongues of fire, right? Because the word pyre literally means lightning in the Greek. And if the Ark of the Covenant was like a big capacitor, collecting electricity all the time, then if a person touched it, it would have arced on them and blasted them with lightning. It's where the law was kept. It's no surprise that we would say that at Shavuot, which is the remembrance of the 10 words coming down from the mountain, which was covered in a cloud and fire or lightning, that there might have been lightning that actually struck the guys that were there, and they were gathered together and the mighty wind blew. But that's a whole other can of worms. All right, this chapter 4 is coming up next. It's going to be recent linguistic research. See how many pages it is. Yeah, I'll read it. It's only like 3 more pages. I'm already a fourth of the way through this book. I don't read much, So I'm not a fast reader, so please forgive me if it's taken a while. I think what we're going to see in this book, that this author is just trying to toss every bit of information he's got to us to get us to believe that the gospel was originally written in Hebrew. You know, I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with it being written in anything, honestly. They could have wrote it in crayon and baby talk as long as I got that. As long as I got to know who Yeshua was, I would be happy, because I know exactly where he would lead me. He would lead me right back to the words of Moses, and then we could really begin the hard study into what we really need to understand, so that we could then return back to the gospel and then understand it. You know, it's like I was listening to a song today, and it said, I can't remember who was singing it, but they said, "Oh, all I want to do is remember the simple gospel," or something like that. I think it was on Bethel Radio on Pandora, and he was saying something like, "I just want to remember the simple gospel." And I was thinking to myself, you know, what is the simple gospel? What is the simple gospel? The simple gospel to me is to say simply that Christ came, he died, he was resurrected, he was sent with the purpose to save a wretch like me. So, how does he do that? He gets you back to understanding what Yehovah wants for you in your life. So, yes, the simple gospel is Christ is going to take you right back into the Old Testament, so that you can come back to him, come back full circle back to him and say, now I actually understand what you did. Now maybe I can move forward and actually really be like you, instead of just marveling at your glory. Because that's when you first come on the scene, it's easy to marvel at the miracles. It's easy to marvel at the glory of Christ. It's easy to be astounded by the dreams you'll have. It's easy to be amazed by the visions, by the feelings, by the prayers being answered, all those things. And yet, when you go back deeper into the Word, you start to say, wait a second, it's an adulterous generation that runs after a sign and a wonder. I had no idea. I was chasing my blessings instead of chasing my obedience to you, And let me tell you, I'm very thankful, because he has been very, very kind to me, especially of late. He's really been pouring it out, and I feel okay about it, because it's been a long time coming. I'm not saying that I deserve anything, but I do feel like I've been listening to what and doing what he wants, at least what I can do that he wants. And I feel like he's making sure that I know that he appreciates me doing what he wants. Anyways, chapter 4, recent linguistic research. A revolution is taking place in our understanding of the New Testament. With the rebirth of Israel in 1947 came the dramatic discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. These priceless ancient manuscripts followed a few years later by the discovery of the Bar Kokhba letters, became vital contributions to a fuller understanding of the New Testament. Now, Bar Kokhba is the man that Rabbi Akiva proclaimed to be the Messiah, who led a revolt against Rome, which after a few years, of course, the Romans defeated him. And at that point, they said, you Jews are not coming back to Jerusalem. Get out. You're not allowed back in. At that point, the temple had already been destroyed, but the Jews could at least return to Jerusalem. I mean, they could be there and be a part of what was going on, and at least feel connected to the ancient city, the capital city of David. But after the Bar Kokhba revolt, that was it. The Romans were done with them. They're like, you're just never come back. You're never allowed to come back. And that was the real last straw scattering of the Jews out in the diaspora. Many scholars in Israel are now convinced that the spoken and written language of the Jews in the land of Israel at the time of Jesus was indeed Hebrew, and that the Synoptic Gospels were derived from the original Hebrew sources. These scholars, fluent in Greek and Hebrew, have proposed impressive solutions to major problems of the New Testament interpretation. important discoveries which have been made to serve to illuminate the very Hebraic style of speech used by Jesus and his first century followers, and to make it possible a more accurate translation of the Gospels, with a new understanding of the language that Yeshua spoke. They are now able to correct numerous mistranslations of the English text and the New Testament. Well, I'm sure he's going to give us some examples. Let's see. The late Jehoshua M. Gretz wrote an article entitled, quote, Hebrew as a spoken and written language of the last days of the Second Temple, and that's from 1960. On the basis of his study of Matthew's Gospel and other literary commentaries of the Gospels, Gretz asserted that, quote, Hebrew was the only literary language of that time, and to this alone we can attribute the fact that the new sect of, quote, unlearned and ignorant men, according to Acts 4:13, set out to write its main book intended for Jewish members in its language. Just like I said, it's a sect of Judaism. Why wouldn't they write new holy writings in Hebrew? Let's see. Moreover, he emphasizes, moreover, Hebrew was then the main vehicle of speech in Jewish Palestine, or at least in Jerusalem and Judea. He provides evidence for this statement with a relevant story narrated in the Talmud in Nedarim 6:6b about the difficulties of an Aramaic-speaking Jew from Babylon and how hard it was for him to communicate with his Jerusalemite wife. So a man from Babylon who spoke pretty much only Aramaic marries a Jewess who lives in Jerusalem who speaks mostly Hebrew and Aramaic, and he has real difficulty getting her to understand all the things he's talking about, which is probably also a commentary on how women are more holy than men, because that's a common thought in Judaism, is that a woman is the source of the spirituality that the children gain in a home. They don't really learn it from their dad, they learn it from their mom. So that's another reason why they say you get your Jewishness from your mother, because she gives you your spirituality. All right. Excuse me. Professor David Flusser of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the world's leading Jewish authority on the New Testament and early Christianity holds strongly to the view that the life of Jesus was originally composed in Hebrew. He claims that there are hundreds of Semiticisms, or that is to say Semitic idioms, or turns of phrase or figures of speech, coins of phrase that are common to Hebrew people. That's what he means. In the Synoptic Gospels, which could only be Hebrew, but there are no Semitisms which could only be Aramaic without also being good Hebrew. Dr. Moshe Bar Ashar, who has inherited the late Professor Yehiziel Kushner's reputation as the foremost Aramaic scholar at Hebrew University, says that he believes the Synoptic Gospels go back to a Greek translation of an original Hebrew, not Aramaic, document. Dr. Pinhas Lepide, director of the School for the Translators and Interpreters of Bar Ilan University in Tel Aviv, has written an article entitled, quote, The Missing Hebrew Gospel, unquote, 1974. In this article, he discusses the Hebrew origins of the Gospels. Dr. Lepide, a scholar fluent in more than a dozen languages, cites, quote here, no less insignificant is the fact bore out by the subsequent documentary finds at Marubaat, Nahal Hebar, and Masada, that throughout the first century of Christianity and later, religious topics were mainly recorded in Hebrew. Dr. Lapide concludes, the past century has witnessed the unexpected discovery of such literary treasures as in Cairo, Geniza, and in Qumran. He shows got a little picture from the Dead Sea Scrolls there. And the Morabah caves, it is not impossible that an excavator may yet unearth a fragment of that earliest Hebrew gospel according to the Jews. Outstanding scholars from outside Israel have also arrived at the conclusion that the language of Jesus was Hebrew. One such scholar is Harris Birkeland, a Norwegian. In this article entitled The Language of Jesus, Birkeland challenges the current view that the language of Jesus was Aramaic. His conclusion is, quote, the language of the common people in Palestine at the time of Jesus was Hebrew. He continues, my further conclusion, that Jesus really used Hebrew, also seems unavoidable. William Sanford Lasore, professor emeritus at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California, is an outstanding Semitic scholar. In a lecture delivered in Jerusalem on April 24th of 1982, he stated, quote, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it now seems highly probable that the language spoke by Jesus was Hebrew and not Aramaic. The sectarians at Qumran not only wrote their whole commentaries on books of the Bible in Hebrew, but their manual for new members, that is a manual for discipling, and books regulating the life of the community, such as the Damascus Covenant, were also all written in Hebrew. So everything that the Essenes had written, they wrote it all in Hebrew. Professor Frank Cross of Harvard University is probably the leading living authority on the handwriting of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Professor Cross has stated that by observing the handwriting of various scribes who copied the scrolls over the centuries at Qumran, it can be seen that the dominant language of Palestine beginning about 130 BC was Hebrew. Since after 130 BC, the scribes of Qumran no longer made mistakes when copying Hebrew text. Cross determined that their principal language was Hebrew, and that they had an inferior knowledge of Aramaic grammar and syntax. Another brilliant scholar is Abbe J.T. Milik, a Polish priest, is a well-known in scientific and archaeological circles. He was one of the excavators of Qumran and the most active member of the international team which prepared the scrolls from Cave 4 for publication. After a careful analysis of all the textual materials from the Judean desert, Milik concluded, quote, the copper rolls and documents from the Second Revolt prove beyond reasonable doubt that Mishnaic Hebrew was the normal language spoken by the Judean population even in the Roman period. The conclusion of the above scholars carry all the more weight when coupled with examples from extra-biblical sources and from the Gospels themselves presented in the following chapters. All right, that's where I'll stop. So, David Bivin and Roy Blizzard are pushing as hard as they can to try to get you into the mindset that people in Palestine in the first century spoke Hebrew fluently. It wasn't just that it was spoken exclusively in the synagogues, but that anyone, again, everybody brought their children to the synagogue. If you were any part of Jewish social life, you went to the synagogue. And if you were Essenes, you actually separated yourself out into tiny communities where you basically spent all day in synagogue. You didn't actually bother to say, hey, let's all get together. It's just, we're together, we're studying, that's all there is to it. Or we're writing a legal document to tell us how to govern ourselves properly, as it says, the Damascus Covenant. Or we're writing a document on how to train people. The Essenes would have been the guys that people would have been like, they're in a cult. Like, they're in a cult. Don't bother with them. Don't let them near your daughters. Don't let them near your sons. They're a cult. They're out there. The Pharisees would have considered them to be too far out. At a certain point, you have to be able to work with the government that God has put over you. And when I say that, I mean Babylon first. There was Daniel, right hand of Nebuchadnezzar. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right there, right hand of Daniel. That's King Nebuchadnezzar taking care of the Jews. Okay? Next up, Artaxerxes. Darius. Here's Daniel once again, right hand of Darius. We've got Nehemiah. Xerxes, right? Esther marries Xerxes. Ezra's the cupbearer of the king. I mean, the only time you really see a bad foreign ruler over Israel is when Antiochus takes over, because he's a bad guy, and even then, he's still backed up by a bunch of Jews who prefer his rulership to the ways of the Pharisees or the ways of the old Jews. But once you integrate, you move over to the west, you go to the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies are good to the Jews. You get into the Roman rule. Julius Caesar is a great patron of the Jews. Augustus Caesar is a great patron of the Jews. You've got to know, as believing people who believe in Jehovah, that when he tells you he's going to do something, he's going to do it. He told them he was going to spread them out. He told them they would be, through Daniel, he told them that they would be ruled by these different, world governments. So you got to know how to work with them, because God's already, and there's a famous, I don't know how many Jews you've met in your life, but you may have met a Jew or two who's named Alexander. I've met two, actually. Both of them were in New Jersey. And you got to wonder, why in the world would Jews name their son Alexander? That's not a Hebrew name, that's a Greek name. Well, that's exactly why they named him that. Because when Alexander the Great came to Jerusalem, Jerusalem surrendered to him without a fight, because it said that the elders of the city came out to him with the scroll of Daniel and said, "It is prophesied that you will rule. We will not fight God. He has already said that you will be ruler." And the price that he made them pay was that they had to name all their male sons Alexander. That was the price. So that's why you'll still meet Jews today who are still named Alexander, because it was a family name now for them. But it initialized when Alexander the Great said, "Name your sons after me, and I'll spare you." So anywho, and then he became a patron. He didn't bother with them much. And like I said, General Ptolemy was good to him. Antiochus not so good to him. But most of the rulers who ruled over Israel worked with the Jews. And unfortunately, the farther we get along, as the Romans go from being a republic to being an empire, and as the empire becomes more and more corrupted, you see the beginnings of an end of a good relationship. Finally, with the Bar Kokhba revolt, it's over. They're not dealing with the Jews anymore. They're out. But anywho, Baruch haba Hashem Yehovah Eloheinu melech haolam. Blessed be the name of Yod He Vav He, for he is King of the universe forever. And thank you everyone for listening with me, and we'll read some more on this book later. It's not nearly as dense or as I would say, or as informative as the Edersheim book is, because good grief, Edersheim write a paragraph and you take 2 hours dissecting the paragraph. There's so much information packed into it. But Mr. David and Mr. Roy are doing their best to help us understand. There is plenty of evidence, particularly in those Dead Sea Scrolls, to demonstrate that people in Judea spoke Hebrew, and even if you look in the Talmud, there's evidence that they preferred speaking Hebrew to speaking Aramaic. So again, thanks for listening, and enjoy your night. Shabbat Shalom.